Hi, Misha here. And last time we kind of looked at the lead up to Incom's X-Wing. We looked at the Z95 and the ARC 170. And this time we'll look at variants of the Empire's TIE Fighter, also known as the TIE LN, TIE Line Fighter. And have 5 different ones here. And we'll just kind of look at the variations. Now, I talked about the standard TIE in an earlier video, so you can kind of refer back to that, and I'm sure it'll pop up in, upcoming stuff in different contexts. But for now, we'll look at the variants, and we'll kind of more or less go with the introduction order when they entered the Imperial Navy. And the first one would be over here. The original TIE Fighter came online a few years after the founding of the Empire and quickly replaced the V-Wing and other Clone Wars era fighters. It was cheap, easy to mass produce, and it was fast and relatively maneuverable. And since it wasn't really going up against major competition, major enemies, it did fine. But one thing the original TIE could not do, it only had 2 lasers, so it could not do strike missions, assault missions, bombing missions. So one of the first variants introduced by Sinar Systems was this, the TIE SA Bomber, the TIE Bomber. And SA stands for Surface Assault, and it was definitely rated for that, as well as attacking capital ships. And it was also configured for pinpoint accuracy. It was larger than the standard TIE at about 8 meters, and it had these larger bent wings to both give more power and to assist in maneuverability and speed, because it could use all the help it could get. It still had 2 twin-ion engines, and they were uprated from the regular TIE, but we have a much larger space frame, carrying a lot more weight. As the name would suggest, it is a bomber. It could carry quite a wide range of payload. In the right pod, we have the cockpit, which did have life support, as well as the computer, the targeting systems, part of the engine. In the left pod, we had a 2-section bomb bay with 2 launchers. And it could carry as many as 16 concussion missiles, 12 proton torpedoes, 8 rockets, or 4 to 6 heavier bombs. It could also lay mines or carry up to 64 small thermal detonators. For defense, it had 2 lasers like the original TIE, and it had a reinforced hull, but again, no shields, no hyperdrive. These are commonly escorted by standard TIE fighters. Even with the uprated engines, because of the weight and everything, it had a top speed of about 850 kilometers. So, yeah. So its main thing was it was accurate, it had a very good targeting system, and it could carry a very heavy payload for what it was. For an example, the standard Y-Wing from the Clone Wars could only carry 12 proton torpedoes too, although the Rebels only usually loaded 8 in to save weight. This could carry the same in a smaller, cheaper package. And once this was introduced, around 15 BBY, they would usually station 1 Squadron 12 on most Star Destroyers, and their first missions were helping mop up separatist pockets, typically attacking surface-to-air installations, other structures, even within cities. They were deadly at that, and they went through the Navy, and they were around during the Battle of Yavin. In fact, they attacked the base at Yavin a short time after the destruction of the Death Star, and they continued to see use. Many were at Hoth. They first assaulted escaping rebel transports, and later they tried to flush out the Millennium Falcon on that asteroid. And they were still present at the Battle of Endor and beyond. Very imperial. And this led to some variants too. This port pod over here was detachable and replaceable. One variant that actually really is canon is the TIE SH for TIE Shuttle. We actually see this in Empire Strikes Back, the same movie we see the TIE Bomber in. It's the ship that Captain Nita takes to quote-unquote apologize to Vader. And we see it leaving his Star Destroyer and going to the Executor. This pod replaces part of the bomb bay with 2 seats for, well, 2 passengers. There is a more extensively modified version known as the TIE BR, which was a boarding craft that could carry 6 to 8 stormtroopers and had a cutting torch to get into the hull of a ship. And while we did not see it in A New Hope, plans, ideas for a double-hulled TIE were drawn up, and it's said that that's what Vader used to get on board the Tantive 4. And there's other variants besides, but those are the 2 that are more or less canon as such. It's pretty iconic. I mean, it was pretty major feature in Empire Strikes Back, and one of the first TIE models we get introduced to. And very imperial. But of course, that was only the beginning. From one of the oldest to one of the newest designs, at least in our real world, the TIE Striker, or the TIE SK. This is also evidence that the, quote, new Star Wars can come up with some interesting designs. I'll talk about how I feel about the T-70 X-Wing and the First Order TIEs another day. But this is from Rogue One. But in universe, this was introduced a few years before Yavin. And this was a specialist craft, much like the TIE Bomber. But this one was designed for atmospheric operations. It is an air superiority fighter. The regular TIE fighter only flew through brute force, repulsor lift, and ion engines. Not very efficient. This has 2, as you can see, horizontal wings with 3 basic positions. Fully up for kind of an attack mode or landing, and then middle just for cruising, and all the way down, curled down as they say, for speed and dashes and what have you. So it's a variable geometry wing craft, although rather different than ours. And it's also designed to be a VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing craft. So this is a fighter patrol craft. It has 4 standard lasers and 2 heavy lasers. But it also has assault capability, kind of ground strike, and for hitting maybe enemy forces on the ground or tanks or what have you. It has a chute, a bomb drop chute, and it can carry proton bombs, much like the TIE Bomber, or concussion grenades, thermal detonators. And it can do so very quickly. It's quite maneuverable in atmosphere, and it's very fast at 1,500 kilometers per hour, much faster than a TIE fighter. It does have basic life support, and it can have a crew of either one or two. It can either just have a pilot, or it can have a pilot and gunner / observer. Instead of carrying bombs or ordnance, it can be a light cargo ship as well, carrying a few tons of supplies or up to 5 troops. And that would be ferrying from orbit to surface and surface to orbit in support of facilities. It could operate in space, but it wasn't at its best. It was an atmospheric fighter for the most part. Again, no shields, very basic life support, and no hyperdrive. But an interesting craft. Now, the TIE SK-1, as it was known, was produced by Sinar Systems, like all of these, but it was a specialist limited production item, although they did make them in reasonable numbers. And not only did the Imperial Navy fly it, because of its planet-based role, the Imperial Army also had some. Kind of interesting. And again, we first see this for Rogue One at the Battle of Scarif. And these were said to be around for Endor and later battles like Jakku. It's quite interesting. Again, it's basic TIE design, as you can see, but changed in a fun, logical way. And this is one of the new Black Series titaniums as they reintroduced the line. The bomber we just looked at is an old one from 15 years ago. Yeah, the wings are metal, but the center body here is plastic, whereas the TIE bomber is pretty much all metal, but then again it is a larger just overall item. But this one has articulation, so there's some added value for that, and the wings are very tight. They adjust easily, and they stay in position. I don't know. Thought I would give it a try. And I'm not disappointed. I think it really does fit in neat, and it would make sense with all the planetary stuff that they would have kind of a planet side based TIE fighter, since all TIEs are short range anyway. And with the wings curled up, it could easily land on very crude, primitive platforms, not needing any kind of special hardware or gear. And again, it's multi-role. It's not just a patrol fighter. It can be a cargo or passenger ship. And Sinar Systems did continue to experiment. This is another new design. First seen in Rebels. This is the TIE Advanced V1, or just TV1. And this was another limited production, experimental, not quite prototype, because they did make a few, but yeah, specialist craft. And work had started on this not long after the foundation of the Empire, and these were in service by 5 or 4 BBY. And they took the basic TIE design. In fact, they made it even smaller. This is only about 4 meters versus about 6 for a standard TIE front to back, and it's actually much shorter because of the curved wings. It's a more compact design, but it doesn't stop there. This had one of the first hyperdrives in a TIE. It wasn't terribly fast, about class 4.5, so it's not going to get you too far, but it's a heck of a lot better than sublight only. And it would carry supplies for a couple of days, so it could make a weekend trip somewhere. It also had life support and rudimentary shields. Nothing too strong, but they could work as a navigational shield or repulse a couple of light laser strikes. As far as offensive capabilities, it had 2 lasers, so pretty standard. And it also had a projectile launcher, kind of a light projectile launcher. It could fire a concussion missile, maybe a proton torpedo. I'm not sure. And I don't know how many it carried, but probably not many, maybe 2 protons and 4 concussions. But it had the ability to carry a launcher, which the standard TIE did not. Now, another thing, you notice the outer sections of these wings don't look like your standard solar arrays we saw in the other TIEs. The bomber and the Striker primarily relied on solar power for everything. This did not. Instead, these smaller wings have armored exteriors, just so they maybe won't be as vulnerable. The insides are still solar panels, but since it's a smaller area and not going to get as much light, those only power some of the sensors and add power to the weapons. Primary power for the engines, computers, comes from a fuel cell. So this has an onboard power source, which does, again, kind of limit range a bit. So it is a bit of a exercise in compromises. Another neat thing, this didn't have to operate from standard racks like a TIE fighter. It could operate from much smaller vessels, corvettes, frigates, even maybe some larger freighters that had space for a fighter, because it is very small. It could even operate from planet surfaces, and to help it land and for storage, the wings actually fold in, which I think is neat, both for the Star Trek universe, Star Wars universe, but neat for Star Trek too, and for this little model toy here, that they're all hinged up, and it's very armored. It seems to me you could fold them in and really be armored for a quick dash too, since your engines aren't relying on the solar. But yeah, that would have let it land in a lot of places and be easily stowed. You can tell it's a larger scale because of how much larger this ball is compared to the standard TIE. But yeah, it's just kind of neat. The V1 TIE Advanced here, the first step to making, well, a more advanced TIE fighter. And these would be flown by elite pilots and probably most famously by the Inquisitors, the fallen Jedi that helped seek out other Jedi that worked with Vader. The Grand Inquisitor, that's what this is supposed to be, his TIE Advanced here. So, elite troops. And while they didn't mass produce these in the tens of thousands like a TIE fighter, they built a few hundred. But of course they cost quite a bit more than a standard TIE fighter, and the Empire was reluctant to give hyperdrives to the rank and file. You can imagine why. But this is neat. I think it's interesting to see their developments. And again, this is something that fits in with Star Wars, but also is different enough. And I like kind of the compact thing it's got going on. This is another one of the Black Series titaniums, and again, the moving parts is pretty neat. The wings are plastic, the ball is metal, and the, I don't know what you call it, struts or wings in here are metal. So the center part is metal, the little folding wings are plastic, which I guess they kind of have to be because of how thin they are. But I think it's a really neat concept, and I say that not really being a fan of Rebels, although I am partial to the Clone Wars. Just kind of pop up and they stick in position. I didn't know these folded at first when I got the model, and I still like the model, but when I kind of got to looking and feeling around on it, I thought, I bet those do something. And sure enough, they do. And see, the hinges are, well, I mean, what do you expect for inexpensive toy model here, made of metal? But, yeah. But that was only kind of the first generation. Now, CNR definitely did not stop there. Next up, we have another TIE Advanced, kind of a parallel alternative concept. This is often called the X1. And this mirrors the real world in aviation, where you'll have a couple of different aircraft competing. For example, the X-32 and the X-35, which become the F-35. And this is better in some ways, and maybe not as good in others as the V1. Its development started a little bit after, but it was underway by 3BBY, and CNR and Vader worked together. In fact, some sources say that Vader approached them with specs to design this version. And it's pretty heavily based on the V-Wing and the ETA-2 from the Clone Wars era. But of course it has quite a bit in common with the V1. Now in the real world, we saw this in the original movie, Star Wars A New Hope, and of course this was the personal TIE fighter, the personal fighter of Darth Vader. But yeah, going back to in-universe, like I said, the V1s were around by about 4 BBY. It seems like Vader got his X1, and it was an early prototype version at that by 1 BBY. And, of course, he would fly it during the Battle of Yavin, where the Death Star was destroyed. Now, it's quite a bit bigger than the V1. It's about 11 meters. And a larger space frame. Notice it takes the wings, or the, solar arrays from the TIE Bomber. They're a little different, but very similar. And we have the same basic cockpit as a TIE fighter up front, but then we have this large deck in the back for extra stuff. Now, this is faster than a standard TIE at about 1,250 kilometers per hour in atmosphere. Now, one thing I didn't mention, the little V1, it was fast. 1,500 to 1,600 kph in atmosphere. That was because of its very small size and additional power source. So this was slower and less maneuverable than both the V1 and the standard TIE. So what'd you get for it? You still have 2 laser cannon, although they are slightly more powerful. More importantly, they have a much more advanced targeting and tracking system than a standard TIE. It also has a multiple warhead launcher, meaning it can fire several mini missiles at once, or maybe a couple of torpedoes. So a more advanced, heavier launcher. It does have a hyperdrive like the V1, but it's class 4, so it's a little bit faster. Also, whereas the V1 only had enough consumables for a couple of days, this was good for 5 days, maybe a week at a stretch. So longer range missions were a possibility with this. In general, it just had more of a power source. Of course, it has full solar panels. It also had a backup fuel cell. So it's more powered. It also has a reinforced hull. And whereas the V1 had very basic shielding, this has pretty standard starfighter shielding. So it's a more durable craft, probably more versatile, and designed for longer range, longer endurance missions. It also had a slightly roomier cockpit because, well, Vader in suit needed it. Although it doesn't seem like it had life support, but sources, some say it does, some say it doesn't. Take your pick. These were put into limited production, much like the V1, enough that a few squadrons were equipped with the X1. And they were considering putting this into full production, replacing the standard TIE fighter with it. But, for one thing, this cost more than the X-Wing. Not by much, but a little bit. And for another, the Empire was, again, as I will say several times, worried about giving hyperdrive-equipped ships to its people. And the Empire needed tens of thousands of ships, so economically it would have been stressful to adopt it. This is an older titanium, again, kind of from the first run. And this thing is a chunk. It's all metal. The wings, the body, the balls. The only thing I can think of that's plastic is the hatch. And that's because it opens to reveal a basic canopy or cockpit inside. But then again, there wasn't much inside of a TIE in the first place. But yeah, this is heavy. In fact, I'm kind of amazed the regular stand holds it. The TIE bomber is heavy too, but this is just longer and got more going on. But you can tell this was definitely a specialist fighter. And again, it was made to be unique looking for A New Hope, so you knew which fighter was Vader's. Interesting fact, after he was knocked out of the way when Han Solo did his thing, of course, obviously Vader survived the explosion of the Death Star, as did his fighter. He seemed to be rather fond of it. He had it restored and refurbished. It was available to him at the Battle of Hoth at 3 ABY, and was aboard the Executor when it got A-winged at the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY. And it looks like he probably had at least one or two spares built as well. So, again, like the V1, they produced at least a few hundred of these. Maybe a few more, because we do see other pilots flying the X1 TIE Advanced at Endor too. But in the end, while many in the Navy wanted this and seen our systems, even perhaps Vader wanted this to be the new TIE fighter, and to be fair, it could have very much given the X-Wing a run for its money, and certainly dominated older craft like the Y-Wing. It was not to be. But all was not lost. The Empire did end up with this. Probably my favorite TIE fighter variant. The TIE Interceptor, the TIE IN. This was a bit of a compromise, but it proved to be a pretty good one. They took all the design study from the V1 and X1 programs and found a way to make a fighter that delivered quite a bit more, but only at about 30 to 40% higher cost than the standard TIE fighter. Now, size-wise, it is about as long as the others at 11 meters, maybe 11 and a half. But of course, a lot of this is just the forward wing. You can see that it kind of has the same basic wing as the X1 and the bomber, but then it's been greatly reduced. And it has the same ball section in the back as a TIE fighter. Now, the earliest prototypes of these were ready by about 1 BBY. Work had begun around the same time as the V1 and X1, and this was kind of the affordable alternative in the program. And with the defeat at Yavin and the realization that the rebels had the X-Wing and were getting a new craft that would become known as the A-Wing very fast, it was decided something had to be done. So this was ordered from limited production into full mass production, and it was supposed to phase out the older TIE fighter for frontline ships. Now, by the time of the Battle of Endor, about 20% of the Imperial Navy standard fighters were the Interceptor here. On a typical Star Destroyer that carried 6 TIE squadrons, 1 would be bombers, 4 would be standard fighters, and 1 would be interceptors here. And of course, later that would have gone to 2 and 3, and then 3 and 2, and so on and so forth. But we never got there because they lost at Endor. So what makes this different? Well, still no shields, no hyperdrive. It does have a reinforced hull. And it does have improved, more powerful twin-ion engines. Like the X1, this was capable of reaching about 1250 kph. And it was much more maneuverable, much more agile than a standard TIE. And even more so than the X1 there, approaching V1 standards. And as far as offense, it had 4 to 6 laser cannons. It's kind of interesting why I say 4 to 6. Traditionally, back old school style, back in the days of X-Wing and TIE Fighter, the games, you had 4 lasers, 1 on each wingtip. That was it. But people that have really watched Return of the Jedi, especially with all the high definition stuff in recent years, have noticed that some of the VFX shots show lasers firing from the ball here. And so some seem to at least have up to 6 lasers. I think the compromise with like Wikipedia is saying that if you have all 6, you have to have an alternative power source like a power cell, or maybe be in an environment that's very bright and sunlit, because having 6 lasers on a ship of this size would be rather difficult. I think they meant to just have 4 on the wingtips, but because they were using parts like the ball from a regular TIE, by necessity, it just had those extra laser points. It's also worth pointing out, fun fact, that with some of the models that were shown for Return of the Jedi, these 2 lower laser cannons were not on the wingtips. This doesn't seem to be intentional. It seems like maybe they were accidentally removed or were broken off or fell off. But we could also say that some versions had the 2 on the ball and 2 on the wings. Make up your thing. So yeah, it was much faster, more agile. It could take more of a hit than a standard TIE, but still without shields, it couldn't take a lot. Still no hyperdrive, still no life support. It did have a little bit more in the way of consumables, whereas the standard TIE was just 1 day. The TIE Interceptor could make it 2 to 3 days with the food and water on board in the air. So a little bit longer range missions. Also, the in-universe explanation for why these wings are cut back is to give a much better field of view for the pilot, which does make sense. It's also said that these house improved long-range sensors and scanners here, which again makes sense. Of course, the real-world explanation is this profile is just cool looking. Bent wings and forky anger. It's a very aggressive looking TIE. So it is very capable. In fact, it was faster than an X-Wing. Really the only thing the Rebels had that could outdo it in those terms was the A-Wing, which itself, while it had shielding, it wasn't very strong. It only had 2 laser cannons. No shields here, but we have 4 to 6 laser cannons. So offensively, it outgunned the A-Wing. Now this particular model toy here is an older titanium. And this is said to be Baron Fell's Interceptor. I thought that was kind of neat. There's also a variant that's the Imperial Guard, which is in red. And it has a couple of little wing stubs sticking out just to differentiate it, but kind of wanted just a standard TIE. It's a good size, too. These old titaniums, they did good size, and it's all metal. I don't know if the canopy opens on this one. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. I don't think much moves on this. I think because of the more complex sculpting, it's just kind of you get what you get. But that's okay. It is a neat ship. And again, I think my favorite tie. And it's really the most advanced dogfighter. Probably the best dogfighter that the Empire had in mass production. The rebels were known to call these nicknames. They called the regular TIE fighter, and as I said in the first video, an eyeball, or an eye. Well, they called this a squint, which has no racial connotations whatsoever. They also called the TIE bomber where they were dupe. For dupe, as in two, duplicate for the two holes, or the fact that it was a sitting duck, and easy to shoot down. So yeah, those are the major Imperial TIE fighters that are actually canon and seen on screen during the original trilogy era. All in all, these seem to be more or less made to scale, with the V1 definitely being the smallest. And then the bomber a little bit smaller than the X1. And then the Interceptor being about the same length as the X1. The one that's a little bit out of scale just because of how big it is already is the SK1, the Striker here. And I get it. These things have to fit in a box and a price point. If they made it to scale, it would be nearly 50% longer than the others. And they don't promise these are in scale anyway, so it's not like you're missing out. There's a lot of detailing on there, though. It's also the lightest one just because of how thin it is. Well, the V1 might be lighter. But yeah, the Imperial ties. Again, they were all Sinar fleet systems developments. And they were all sub-light except for the advances. And of course, there is the TIE Defender, but that's only recently become kind of canon. There is the TIE Defender in the old Titanium line based on the old X-Wing and TIE Fighter games, but I don't have one of those and probably won't because asking price for them these days is rather out of what I'm willing to pay for these. But that's alright. Again, it's soft canon, really. These are the ones we saw directly on screen in the films, well, except for the V1. But kind of got this one by accident, to be honest with you. It came in a package, and when I read the description, I was like, what the hell is a Inquisitor TIE Advanced? I thought it might just be like the Vader one, so I was pretty happy when it was something totally different. The Bomber's always been a long time favorite of mine. The Striker is really impressing me. I think it's a great new design. The X1, honestly, it's neat enough. I mean, I like it. It's classic. It reminds me of childhood, but it's probably about my least favorite TIE design. But it's still neat. It's just a little kind of chunky. The model's nice, though, the toy, because it's all metal. Definitely the heaviest. But yeah, the Interceptor here is the nicest TIE, the neatest one, the most interesting. And I really like Return of the Jedi. Over the years, it and Empire have swapped back and forth as my favorites. Definitely as a kid, Return of the Jedi was my favorite. So what do you think of ties, and what should I do next? Go back to some Rebels? Go back to some capital ships? Don't know. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.